revolution versus evolution. And we've certainly seen a lot of welcome progress on automatic exchange of information in the G20 and the G8 recently, and the OECD has been tasked to develop an action plan on base erosion and profit shifting. I mean, I think even 5 years ago, some of this progress would very much have been unthinkable. So does that constitute revolution? Or does progress remain too slow and perhaps commitments too vague? For instance, has there been too little progress on country-by-country reporting for multinational corporations? The issue of beneficial ownership still remains a little bit thorny. There's no clear time frame for some of the commitments that have been made on automatic exchange of tax information, for instance. So in that context is what we're seeing evolution. So I actually came to the conclusion that perhaps we should see the progress through a different lens. Perhaps we should see it through the lens of divine intervention. That the new interest in various aspects of illicit financial flows has been driven in part due to the financial crisis and in part to the budget crisis, in large part due to the budget crisis that we've seen in many European countries, in the United States, that basically in the developed world the coffers are dry. So we see an interest in this issue because they see it as a way to help raise valuable resources. They lose revenues too. It's not just an issue for the developing world. So the challenge for us now, I think, as policymakers or as policy specialists, as analysts, as academics and so on, is to work together to think about how we can capitalize on this recent momentum, regardless of whether it's revolution or evolution. But perhaps before I talk about the possible place of illicit financial flows in the post-2015 era, I thought it's probably useful to give you a quick overview of what all the post-2015 noise is all about, because there's certainly been a lot of fanfare recently. Post-2015 seems to be everywhere at the moment. So as you probably know, the current internationally agreed framework on development, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, expire in 2015. And last year, the United Nations system launched an unprecedented, and I mean unprecedented, global consultation on what should succeed the Millennium Development Goals. I think it's fair to say that the scale of the consultations that we've seen is truly remarkable, and we've witnessed a truly incredible response. We've organised national consultations in 88 countries around the world, 11 thematic consultations on issues such as governance, education, health, the environment, peace and security, and so on. Over 1.5 million people have voted in an online survey that we've organised called My World. There's still time to vote if you haven't done so already, about what priorities you have, what matters to you. And we've seen the Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons on post-2015 deliver their report on what should succeed the Millennium Development Goals. I think the interest that citizens around the world have shown in this consultation process is extremely encouraging and inspiring. In fact, we've reached out to people whose voice is not normally heard on many of these issues. But I also think that it means expectations are extremely high as to what the new agenda should deliver post-2015. And I think that's a huge responsibility for governments around the world now, as well as for the United Nations system. So while the journey to define the main ingredients of a new sustainable development vision post-2015 is still under discussion, I think it's fair to say that the main details will probably be thrashed out next year in 2014. Attention has already, and perhaps inevitably, turned to questions about how precisely this new sustainable development framework will be paid for. Where will the money come from? Isn't that the million or even billion or even $trillion question? Or as my 5-year-old son would say, Mummy, isn't that the gazillion dollar question? I haven't worked out how many zeros there are in a gazillion yet, but I'm sure it's quite a lot. And I think that it's fair to say that whatever framework finally emerges, it's likely to be very, very expensive. So where will the money come from? And what will the responsibilities be of different stakeholders, public and private, domestic and international, and where do financial flows, illicit financial flows, rather, fit into this picture? And did the issue even fit into the picture last time around? I think it's actually useful to look at that, that question about whether illicit financial flows were part of the picture last time. And the short answer to that question is no. Illicit financial flows were not part of the picture last time around for the MDGs. MDG 8 was sort of the add-on MDG. It was intended to be about the enabling environment for development and focus mainly on pledges to increase aid, to reduce debt, increase access to medicines, increase access to new technologies, remove trade barriers, and so on. The MDG, I think it's fair to, MDG 8 was heavily criticised, I think it's fair to say, for being weak on sort of concrete targets, whereas some of the other MDGs, had concrete measurable targets, for instance, to reduce poverty by half. MDG 8 was criticised for just sort of containing a vaguer set of commitments. I suppose interpreted more broadly, illicit financial flows did figure of sorts in Target 8A, which was to develop further an open, rule-based, predictable, non-discriminatory trading and financial system. But from an operational perspective, illicit financial flows were entirely absent, and donors, in fact, were assessed against the measures they took on trade to remove trade barriers and so on. And sort of the financial system aspect of MDG 8 Target A were largely sort of swept under the carpet and forgotten, very much so. But despite this apparent failure under the sort of the strict MDG framework, I think it's also fair to say that there has been other progress made on illicit financial flows within the UN over the last decade, and I'd like to point to perhaps three notable examples. The UN Monterey Consensus of 2002 looked in particular at asset repatriation and stronger cooperation on money laundering. Perhaps the flagship convention of 2005, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, sort of took those commitments a step further on asset repatriation and money laundering and so on. And in 2008, the Doha Declaration, this was the first time that specifically the language of illicit financial flows made it in. Again, I think pointed to the fact that, or it shows the fact that there's a continued interest in an acknowledgement on the part of UN member states that this issue is important. This shows that steady progress, incremental progress, is happening, and I think this is very encouraging as we devise a sort of a new set of goals for post-2015. So moving now to post-2015, what prospects are there to build on the recent momentum that our speakers have already spoken extensively about? I mean, quite a lot, I would contend. Can we get illicit financial flows into a new SDG 8, SDG meaning Sustainable Development Goals? I think early indications show that there is appetite for some sort of goal on the enabling environment. How should illicit financial flows be incorporated into the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agreement? Should there be specific goals or targets related to illicit financial flows? And if so, what should they look like? Should they apply to all countries, or should there be differentiated goals for different sets of countries? I think these are the sorts of questions that civil society, academia, and so on should help policymakers to think about over the coming period. And I think a lot of important progress has been made already, which has already been spoken about. We've seen commitments on automatic exchange of information within the G8 and G20. We've seen transparency provisions pushed through for the extractive industry sector in particular in the United States, in the EU. There's been a renewed focus and interest on asset repatriation, that even if in practical terms this remains difficult, it's on the political agenda. It's important. We have the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which is a partnership between the World Bank, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and others. And we see an interest in base erosion and profit shifting. G20 has tasked the OECD to develop an action plan in this area. I mean, this is all extremely, extremely encouraging. So, I mean, looking forward, I think it would be very easy to develop a long laundry list of what needs to happen within the post-2015 period on illicit financial flows. I mean, some of the propositions that we could try to concretize and secure political commitment on include, but are not limited to, country-by-country reporting for multinational enterprises, commitments on beneficial ownership, support to countries to build regional agreements to address tax competition and excessive tax incentives, commitments to assist countries to build the necessary tax capabilities and expertise to perhaps boost aid in this direction. And we could also call for an agenda for research and for data collection and dissemination, which could be defined in a post-2015 agreement. Research is often hampered by poor data, and given that the situation between countries varies considerably, it probably would be useful to understand more about the specific circumstances and main drivers and dynamics of illicit financial flows in a specific country context. I think we need to balance ambition with pragmatism. In my view, the end outcome is likely to be a more generalized statement of intent. So I think while we should be ambitious to make calls for certain commitments in a particular direction, the likely outcome will be the subject of intense negotiation and is likely to be somewhat more generalized. And perhaps here I would like to emphasize a few dynamics that I hope are useful to you. These dynamics, I think, will undoubtedly influence the final outcome, and I think therefore it's important to take them into consideration as we think about how to insert this agenda into the post-2015 process. These dynamics are both positive and negative. So first, on the positive side, I think the post-2015 development framework is being negotiated at a time when there's momentum on illicit financial flows and interest in this issue. Within many international fora, such as the G20, the OECD, the UN has its own work program and work streams on this issue. So the momentum is there, the knowledge, the awareness has increased substantially. So I think in that sense, we can try to ensure that this issue is reflected and we can build on that momentum. Secondly, another positive element, that on the one hand, governments are still reeling from the recession, from the economic crisis in the developed world, and aid budgets have suffered as a consequence, which is unfortunate. And governments are quite suspicious at the moment of making new financial commitments for development. So on the positive side for this agenda, that means that governments will be thinking about ways that countries can mobilize more resources domestically for development, and this agenda sort of follows on from that. So thirdly, I think on the environmental side, this is going to be a sustainable development agenda. So there's the risk that the sustainable element, the environmental sort of concerns and issues will sort of overshadow some of the other issues which people see as important. And finally, on the negative side, this sort of the post-2015 agreement is happening at a time where there's a crisis of multilateralism. So there is a decreased confidence in international institutions and what they can deliver. There's more interest and a renewed focus on domestic policies and domestic priorities. However, on the other hand, there's a renewed interest in the developing world, at least, on regional initiatives and regional priorities, and perhaps that can be useful. So looking forward, there are definitely avenues open to you as civil society and academia to influence this process, to influence the discussions at the intergovernmental level. There is an intergovernmental committee of experts on financing for sustainable development that has been established. It met for the first time in August this year, and it will meet again in December. It will have its second meeting in December this year. It's been tasked to evaluate proposals and prepare a report on a sustainable development financing strategy for post-2015. It will conclude its work by August 2014. It will invite formal statements, submissions and proposals for consideration from a variety of stakeholders. So you have the opportunity there to sort of put your views to this intergovernmental committee of experts and try to influence the contents of their report. I've put the link up for you there if you would like more information on the work of that committee. So in conclusion, I would just like to assure you of the UN's continued commitment on this issue of illicit financial flows, and we're working, we're very happy to work with you to try to secure the best possible goals and to make sure that illicit financial flows are reflected in that final commitment. Many thanks.